The Honourable Minister of State for Western Economic Diversification.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's with profound sincerity and gravity that I stand today to speak in support of this bill, which provides additional legislation to address the disgusting, abhorrent, and deeply misogynistic practice of early and forced marriage, as well as so-called honor killings. So let's get to the heart of the matter, because the key piece of opposition resistance to this has been the use of the term barbaric. We've heard it over and over again from the opposition. In fact, I pulled the NDP Status of Women's Critic speech on this, and she said the short title of this bill, the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, is truly xenophobic. It isolates a community, calling it barbaric for its violence against women. This is a problem that exists everywhere. This particular statement is hyperbolic, and it clearly understands that the NDP has not looked at the form and substance of this bill, because there is no reference to any community. What our government is trying to do with this piece of legislation is send a clear message that Canada and its pluralistic culture, which respects the rights of women, which respects the rights of equality of personage, does not allow in any way, shape, or form this particular practice in our country. Exactly. It isolates women in the practice. What actually isolates women when we talk about isolation in a community is this practice, and that's why it must end. That's why our law enforcement officials must have every tool at their disposal in order to be able to combat this practice. So let's ask the question, Mr. Speaker, is this practice barbaric? Let's talk about it right here and right now. So barbaric is defined as savagely cruel and exceedingly brutal and primitive. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that taking away choice from a woman, from being forced into a marriage, it takes away the fundamental freedoms that we're afforded in this country as women in equality of personage. This practice equates to women becoming property where they are sold. And that is barbaric. That is not equal. That is primitive. That is well beyond where we are as a country, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I want to read some stats about what early and forced childhood marriage means to women. Every year, millions of girls, some as young as 5 years old, are forced into marriage. 1 in every 3 girls in the developing world is married by the age of 18. 1 in 9 marries before the age of 15. And complications in childbirth are the leading cause of death among girls between the ages of 15 and 19 in the developing world. Globally, between 2004 and 2014, an estimated 100 million girls will have been forced to marry before their 18th birthday. Girls who are married before 18 are more likely to report being beaten by their husbands and forced to have sex than girls who marry later. 90% of adolescent pregnancies in the developing world are to girls who are already married. A study in Kenya and Zambia found that among 15 to 19-year-old girls who are sexually active, being married increases their chances of having HIV by more than 75%. Girls under 15 are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than women aged 20 to 24. And Mr. Speaker, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 states that marriage shall be entered into only with the free and full consent of intending spouses. And this, Mr. Speaker, is because we know that early and forced marriage takes young girls out of education. It removes their ability to achieve their full potential in their society. It isolates them. So, Mr. Speaker, is this practice barbaric? You're darn right it is. And our government will absolutely call a spade on that. And we will continue to ensure that people across this country and across the world understand that this is a leading cause of women not having full economic participation and full rights. So is it barbaric? Yes. Now, Mr. Speaker, my colleague across the way talked about, well, let's dance around if, we should use the word cultural practice. The member from Pierre Faulds-Dillard in one of her speeches said she takes issue with the word cultural in the title of the bill, and so do many Canadians. The great irony in this debate, Mr. Speaker, is that it was the NDP Status of Women critic who cited the following study in her speech, and this was from a report entitled Report on the Practice of Forced Marriage in Canada, Interviews with Frontline Workers, prepared by Naima Bendris, presented to the Department of Justice in November 2008. And the report cited, and again, this was in the NDP Status of Women's Critics speech, although contrary to the law and an infringement of human rights under international law, Forced marriage is most often the repetition of a cultural practice and a significant part of matrimonial traditions, and families which practice it. So again, Mr. Speaker, the NDP, they're probably reading a speech that was prepared for them that they didn't do research on. Right in the NDP status of women's speech, she acknowledges the reason why this title is what it is. So, Mr. Speaker, let's look beyond the title, which I think calls a spade and adequately says that this is something that is a barbaric cultural practice, and talk about why it is necessary. Because part of the other discussion that's come up here, Mr. Speaker, is that the criminal code already covers these practices. Well, Mr. Speaker, let's go through some of the legislative components of this bill. So, Mr. Speaker, right now, a temporary resident who practices polygamy in their country of origin is generally allowed to enter with only one spouse at the time seeking of entry. Now, Mr. Speaker, under this change, a foreign national seeking temporary residence would be found inadmissible if they try to enter with even one spouse, Mr. Speaker. And again, there's some other things that are just so pertinent. The one that I want to highlight is with regard to a peace bond, Mr. Speaker. Just try and find this. So, Mr. Speaker, right now, if there's any grounds that the law enforcement officials suspect in terms of a forced marriage situation about to occur, there's certain situations in which you can order a peace bond. We're looking at ways to make that easier and more effective so that people can end an abusive situation in a much more expeditious fashion. So where there are reasonable grounds under this legislation, where there are reasonable grounds to believe a person will specifically aid or participate in forced or early child marriage ceremony involving someone else, for example, their child, or will take a young person out of Canada for the purposes of a forced and or early marriage ceremony abroad, they could be brought to court and ordered to enter into a peace bond to keep the peace and be of good behavior. A court would be empowered to make court orders that could be particularly useful in specifically preventing an earlier forced marriage, whether in Canada or abroad, or such as ordering the person to surrender travel documents and refrain from making arrangements or agreements in relation to marriage, or to participate in a family violence counseling program. The other measure in here, there are several, and I encourage the opposition to actually read through the change from the existing legislation to the new legislation. But again, as my colleague, the Minister of Multiculturalism mentioned, the taking away the provocation argument with regard to the defense of so-called honor killings. So again, going back to the term barbaric, having someone make an argument against murdering a daughter or a relative because of their life choices in a free and democratic country, one should not be able to argue that these women did something to offend the honor or their delicate sensibilities that's justified by murder. Exactly. That is not Canadian. That's not part of our pluralistic culture whatsoever, Mr. Speaker. You know what that is? That's barbaric. And what we're trying to do with these common sense pieces of legislation and amendments to our criminal code is prevent that practice and send a clear message that we do not support it. Now, Mr. Speaker, some of the other arguments is, well, maybe we should, just look beyond the criminal code and there's somehow an argument that we're not doing other things in Canada to support women who are in these situations, and I strongly disagree with that. I will look, in the time I have left, quickly both internationally and at home. Internationally, we've invested heavily, and our country is becoming world leaders in the fight against early and forced childhood marriages. For example, the Minister of Foreign Affairs last year announced that Canada is contributing $20 million over 2 years to UNICEF towards ending early childhood and forced marriages. There's several other international measures and aid measures that we've done to support this. Here at home, through special language programs for immigrant and refugee women, we were able to address issues such as family violence, spousal abuse, women's rights, legal rights and responsibilities, several different initiatives through the Department of Justice, sector-specific workshops, legal education pamphlets. And, Mr. Speaker, since our government came into office in 2007, we funded through Status of Women Canada over 70 million projects to prevent and eliminate violence against all women here in Canada. And I'll close with this, Mr. Speaker. When you look at our record of preventing violence against women, it was this government that stood up and gave First Nation and Aboriginal women the right to own property, the same right that every other Canadian woman has, which allows abusers to be moved from homes and women to have have the same right that every other Canadian woman does. It's our government that stands up on criminal justice legislation. It is this party across the way that consistently votes against this, and we are standing up for women and standing against misogyny.
Hear, hear.
Question et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable député de Rivière-des-Mille.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know that the government has no credibility whatsoever in preventing violence against women. The member opposite cited S-2, which is relating to matrimonial property rights on reserve, which was actually opposed by a First Nations group across the country, opposed by First Nations women, because it doesn't actually protect victims. And we see the same problems found in this bill S-7, which is supposed to prevent forced marriages. Although we see that this bill has many adverse effects, among other things, it will actually expel from Canada the victims of forced marriages and the victims of potential spousal abuse. So we see that this is private member's bill, or the Senate bill actually does not receive support from the very groups that represent the women that the Conservatives say that they're helping. So I'd hope that the government would be open to amending this bill to make sure that victims are not expelled from Canada, that they're not put in this even more precarious situation that this bill would put them in. I'd also like to know why the government has not actually worked to put into place measures to prevent violence against women, why they haven't actually put into place services that would help the victims of forced marriages, and why the government has no plan in terms of transmitting to these immigrants, these women, information on services that are available to them and services that are available to help them in their integration into Canadian society.
The Honourable Minister of State.
Mr. Speaker, her last assertion was false. Our government has provided several different packages through Citizenship in Immigration Canada, pamphlets, educational materials, workshops, working with immigrant services groups to ensure that, and you know what, our local police services for people to understand that they have rights under this country, and it's been our government that's been standing up for them while they've been voting against them. The second assertion that was false was that our government has not been funding programs to support violence against women. Just through Status of Women Canada alone, over $70 million to prevent violence against women. And Mr. Speaker, I find it deeply embarrassing that my colleague opposite could stand up in this place and say that we should not support a bill that would give adequate rights, equal rights to First Nation and Aboriginal women that every other Canadian woman in this country had. It took over 20 years to get that piece of legislation. It's one of the most proudest moments that our government has had to stand up and say that there's equality in legislation and in property ownership in that group of people. So shameful.
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Mr. Speaker, I'll save some time for commenting on the whole Aboriginal file in terms of abuse when I get the chance to speak to the bill. But my question that I have for the member is related to the first question I asked her colleague, and that is that there should not be a link between domestic violence and abuse of women and the idea of culture. All societies have that gender issue. There is no society that does not have to deal with the gender violence issue. My question to the member is why does the government feel it's necessary to incorporate culture when, in fact, it's just not warranted?
The Honourable Minister of State.
My question to my colleague opposite is why he finds it necessary to stand up behind a leader who dances around issues that are of deep and grave importance to the equality of women in this country, such as calling a spade, that these particular practices are barbaric. It was his leader that took offense to calling these just deeply misogynistic and disgusting practices what they are, barbaric. I dedicated 5 minutes of my speech to the topic, Mr. Speaker. And again, I'd refer him to the report that I mentioned earlier in my speech to the Department of Justice, which said, although contrary to the law and an infringement of human rights under international law, forced marriage is most often the repetition of a cultural practice and a significant part of matrimonial traditions in families which practice it. Rather than arguing over semantics, Mr. Speaker, let's get on with the business of protecting Canadian women.